Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to begin with a couple of personal acknowledgements, like everyone in this House does. But I just want to begin by thanking all the members in this House that serve in this House, have the opportunity to serve at and represent the constituents in their community, in their region of the province, Mr. Speaker, for taking the time this past week to speak and speak passionately with respect to the finances of the province, with respect to the services here in the province, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, despite differences that we may have, to acknowledge that those differences are quite small when you compare them to differences in opinion around the world, Mr. Speaker. And I myself would like to acknowledge and thank each and every member on both sides of this House for the service that they perform each and every day in coming to this House and going to their constituency and in representing those constituents here in this House. Mr. Speaker, thank you to each of you. Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank the Minister of Finance for the effort that she has led, Mr. Speaker, in putting together this budget. As we have said, this budget is not really the work of just a couple of months or even the work of this past year. This is a budget that has come together through a commitment that was made in this House, Mr. Speaker, and in this province by the previous fellow that had the opportunity to sit in my chair, and all of us, Mr. Speaker, of returning our province to a balanced budget this year. And I want to thank the Minister of Finance. I want to thank all of those in her office here in this building, and I want to thank all of those in the Ministry of Finance for their leadership on bringing this all together so that we can continue to say that we are a government that will always do what we say we're going to do.
Hear,
Mr. Speaker. Members of Treasury Board that don't get to go on holidays in January, Mr. Speaker, thank you or ever, essentially, or weekends, or summer, or any other day, Mr. Speaker, in the assembling of this budget, and also for their work throughout the year in ensuring that we stay on track, Mr. Speaker, on track with the targets that we put forward, the budgets that we put forward each and every year. This is ultimately the last budget in our planned growth plan, Mr. Speaker, our vision of 2020 and beyond, which was a plan that we consulted, many here were around at its inception, where we consulted with the people across the province, Mr. Speaker, on what would our communities, what would our province look like out to the year 2020, Mr. Speaker, and we brought that information together, and we've created a vision on behalf of the people of the province in conjunction and partnership with the people of the province, Mr. Speaker, and that I've always said that the consecutive budgets since 2012, when that plan was introduced, have really been rungs in the ladder for us to achieve as many of the points and as many of the commitments and as many of the targets that the people of this province had set out for us to achieve as their elected members and as their government, Mr. Speaker. And this budget, I think, is a good way for us to come to the conclusion of that plan, Mr. Speaker, in the months and weeks ahead, Mr. Speaker, as it ultimately completes our 3-year plan to balance on behalf of those people, Mr. Speaker, but it also is the right balance for the people of the province, Mr. Speaker, understanding it's balanced first and foremost, but it's also balanced in its investment in the services and the infrastructure and really what the people of this province expect their provincial government to be providing on their behalf. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple of people that I also want to thank that are no longer in this assembly, but were very much a part of this 3-year plan and very much a part of in fairness, the success of this government and in many cases the success of decisions that we have made as a government, I think that has extended to the broader economy and communities across the province. And that is first, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Kevin Doherty, who carried some very, very heavy pails of water in the early days of embarking on some very difficult decisions, Mr. Speaker, that I was very proud, if you will, to be a part of just a week ago in this assembly when we actually achieved that balanced budget, Mr. Speaker. And we owe Kevin Doherty a great debt of thanks.
You bet.
And Mr. Speaker, of course, the former Premier Brad Wall, for his leadership and vision, really, for us to be able to stand here today as a government, for myself to stand here as the current Premier of the province, Mr. Speaker, and say to the people of the province that We have balanced the budget, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to invest, and we will continue to invest in our economy. We'll continue to invest in the services that matter to you and your family and your community, and we'll continue to invest in the infrastructure that is important to the people of the province of Saskatchewan. So thank you, Brad.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, all of us have, I know, taken the opportunity to thank the people that ensure the wheels and the doors are open, the wheels are rolling and the doors are open in our constituency offices. And I have Sally Fitch manning the door in my office. Mr. Speaker, Sally's had a difficult year, Mr. Speaker. She lost her husband this year suddenly, Bookie, as we all know him, or Alan Fitch, Mr. Speaker, and she has done a tremendous job for me since I've been elected. And as I always say, Mr. Speaker, thankfully she is not only the ears and the eyes of the constituency office, but she's the face of the constituency office and not myself so much, Mr. Speaker. So thank you, Sally, for everything that you do each and every day in representing the people in the constituency that we represent together. And last but not least, I have a wife that doesn't get to see her husband a whole big bunch, and I think some days she might like it that way, Mr. Speaker. But we don't serve in this assembly alone. We only serve with the support of our families, our children, our parents, and our spouses, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my wife, and I thank everyone's spouse and partner in this journey of representing the people in our constituencies and collectively representing the people of the province, Mr. Speaker, and all together really ensuring that this province is the great place that we know and love. This is an important day, Mr. Speaker. This is an important day, but it's an important day for a number of other reasons. We have a member of this assembly that answered his 1,000th question today, Mr. Speaker. He is for the very 1,000th time, Mr. Speaker. I would put forward that each and every one of those questions was better as we went along. As well. Answered, sorry. Mr. Speaker, it's an important day as we have a budget decision to make in this House, Mr. Speaker. What I think is a solid budget, the right balance for the people of the province that will be put forward. But it's also an important day in the community of Shelburne, Mr. Speaker, and throughout, I would say, the northern forest fringe of Saskatchewan as we get close to the end of our hockey leagues in North America, Mr. Speaker, most notably the NHL, and this is a tough time of the year for us Edmonton Oilers fans, Mr. Speaker. In a few more decades, I may feel like a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, Mr. Speaker. But it is the end of. It is the end of the season also for a very noted high-caliber hockey league in northern Saskatchewan, known as the SPHL, Mr. Speaker, and their wind-up is this evening. And if everything goes well, I'm actually hoping to get back, Mr. Speaker. That's the SPHL, which I know we would all be fully aware of, is the Shelburne Pickup Hockey League, Mr. Speaker. A very high-caliber league, Mr. Speaker, on Thursday evenings. You're all invited to show up one evening. There's no reservation required. Mr. Speaker, more on to the matter at hand, and with respect to the budget that we have been discussing here in this Assembly over the course of the last week. There's some context for this debate, Mr. Speaker, and it's important to acknowledge the ongoing strength of our province, the strength of Saskatchewan, if you will, the progress that we continue to see in this province despite some serious challenges that often get discussed on the floor of this Assembly or outside, Mr. Speaker. But I would say this. Despite those discussions, Mr. Speaker, the recipe for success in this province continues to work as it has for the last decade, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to follow the ingredients on that recipe, Mr. Speaker, and it's working, and it's most notable with last week with Statistics Canada just reported that our population again grew, Mr. Speaker, by some 11,459 people in 2018, Mr. Speaker. We have had 50 straight quarters of population growth in this province, the largest sustained population growth since they've kept records, Mr. Speaker. This is a point that we can all in this Assembly, I think in fairness, be very proud of, a point that has resulted, Mr. Speaker, in over 160,000 people living in our province, calling a community in Saskatchewan home. And as I said earlier today, I see this in my community with people that are staying there, children that are staying there, Mr. Speaker, to find their careers, but also people that are moving to our communities, rural and urban, across the province, from countries all over the world. Mr. Speaker, this is only possible with a vibrant and growing economy. Mr. Speaker, and last month, actually, our economy created another 9,000 9,000 jobs, the most jobs ever created in the month of February on record. Mr. Speaker, this is the second consecutive month that our jobs have grown by number here in the province, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to see strong manufacturing and wholesale trade numbers here in the province. These are good statistics. There are statistics, Mr. Speaker, but they are good statistics. Our exports continue to grow, which is the ultimate source of the wealth in our communities, Mr. Speaker, and the food and the fuel and the fertilizer that we are so proud to produce in this province. It's in demand around the world, despite the conversations we have around market access and ensuring they're produced in the most sustainable way possible, of which ours are, Mr. Speaker. But we might observe this, that our world, not just our province, but our world is a better place because of what we do here in the province of Saskatchewan, what we do in agriculture, what we do in energy, and what we do in mining, for instance, or what we do in the research community, Mr. Speaker. There's more than 1 billion people around the world that have been lifted out of extreme poverty over the course of the last 25 years. That's a statistic from the World Bank, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's important for us to understand and realize and be proud of the impact that we are having on that statistic. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has played such an important role in what I believe is an incredible story, and the most exciting statement about all of that is we're just getting started. We're just getting started in this province, Mr. Speaker. Our provincial economy is growing even with the headwinds that we face and we discuss, and that economic strength it's supported by sound government finances, Mr. Speaker, most notable in the budget vote that is going to take place here shortly. Mr. Speaker, last week our Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker, delivered a budget that we had said collectively is the right balance, delivered on behalf of the people of this province, a budget that balances our fiscal responsibility with the need to have the ability to invest out into the future, the need to invest not just in this generation or even this year, Mr. Speaker, but that ability to invest into our children's generation. We were determined to do everything we could to balance this budget, Mr. Speaker, this year with no new taxes and no tax increases, and we've achieved that. We achieved a balanced budget, the right balance, Mr. Speaker, that continues with the largest investment in our children, in our next generation, Mr. Speaker, the largest investment in education in the history of the province of Saskatchewan. In health care, also the largest investment in the history of the province, and most notably, the largest investment in mental health care treatment here in the province of Saskatchewan. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest in critical infrastructure across this province, Mr. Speaker, in a multitude of our ministries as well as our crown corporations, Mr. Speaker. This is most certainly and most importantly, this balanced budget fulfills a solemn promise, as I said, that we made 3 budget cycles ago, 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, to the people of this province. We put in place that 3-year plan to balance, and we followed it to a T. Mr. Speaker, we've been on track to balance that budget, and this year, on behalf of the people, we're very, very proud to do that. And I think it's also important for us to remember the circumstances that we faced that particular year. Mr. Speaker, I remember the conversation with respect to a $1.3 billion shortfall in our resource revenues here in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, a significant challenge for sure. I heard the Leader of the Opposition say this wasn't the worst budget that he's heard. It was 2 years ago was the worst budget that he has observed, Mr. Speaker. Well, we were very committed to not closing our educational institutes, not closing our schools across the province, Mr. Speaker. We were very committed to not closing hospitals across the province, Mr. Speaker, which is something very different from budgets that we saw a few decades ago when faced with a similar challenge. Mr. Speaker, in that time and in that place, Mr. Speaker, there was a different choice that was made. There was a choice to close 50-plus hospitals across this province, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to build hospitals in our communities. Mr. Speaker, there was a choice made a couple decades ago to close 176 schools across this province, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to build schools in our communities across this province, Mr. Speaker. And the reason is we have a strong and vibrant and growing economy, and people are moving here, Mr. Speaker, and they need schools to attend. Their children need schools to attend, and they need health care facilities to attend to the services that they have, Mr. Speaker. I think it's also important to note that today, three budget cycles ago, we were faced a $1.3 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker. Today, we're still, if we had gone status quo, not increased spending to any degree at all for inflation or for expansion of serving those extra people, those additional people that have moved to our communities, we would still be faced with today a $788 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker, due strictly to a shortfall in our resource revenues. Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't for the courageous decisions that were taken of the day by members on this side and then Finance Minister Kevin Doherty and the leader of our province at that point in time, Premier Brad Wall, we would be $788 million in deficit today if we didn't spend another nickel. Those courageous decisions, Mr. Speaker, Buckley's mixture, as I've heard them discuss, Mr. Speaker, were most certainly necessary. They were most certainly necessary for us to move, Mr. Speaker, to not be as reliant on our resource revenues here in the province. And are some other statistics. We went from a high of 35% of our provincial revenues coming from resource revenues, Mr. Speaker. Our average high was about 25%. This budget puts forward about 11% of our revenues are coming from natural resource revenues, Mr. Speaker. This is by far the most solid budget in recent history, Mr. Speaker, and it's been put together over the course of 3 years, ensuring that we are able to not close schools, build schools, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that we're able to not close hospitals and cut services, Mr. Speaker, but expand services in mental health care and continue to build infrastructure across the province, Mr. Speaker. This is most certainly a budget that is balanced, but it is the right balance on behalf of the people of this province. Mr. Speaker, we've talked, I also heard the Leader of the Opposition discuss that how can a budget be balanced if you're loaning money? Well, NDP British Columbia did it, Mr. Speaker. They loaned $5 billion for their infrastructure plan this particular year. Our infrastructure plan in this province, Mr. Speaker, all told, when you bring in the replacement of our SaskPower and our Crown Corporation's infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, when you bring in our commitment to new schools and new hospitals across the province, when you bring in to play our commitment, Mr. Speaker, with respect to our highway traffic safety initiative, Mr. Speaker, a $65 million 5-year initiative to ensure that the intersections in our province are safer for our families, Mr. Speaker, as they travel up and down our highways. Mr. Speaker, we are investing $2.7 billion in infrastructure over the course of this next year. We are loaning $1.8 billion for that infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, but most certainly, and we will see the auditor, I am confident, speak to this in the months ahead, Mr. Speaker. This is a balanced budget. It's a balanced budget that strikes the right balance of investment in our infrastructure across the province. Investment, Mr. Speaker, that is so very important for our communities and for the people that we serve and live in those communities. For example, Mr. Speaker, in education, $3.3 billion invested just this year. 2.48 in K-12 education, Mr. Speaker, and we've heard our Minister of Education, our Deputy Premier, speak this week with respect to that investment, but it's also important for us to always note where we've been. When we started, Mr. Speaker, in 2007, we were with an education budget line item of less than $1 billion in our K-12 education. Mr. Speaker, today, that line item is almost $2.5 billion, the largest it has ever been in the history of the province, Mr. Speaker, investing in schools, but also investing in the supports for learning in the classrooms, Mr. Speaker, investing in over 900 more teachers, Mr. Speaker, most certainly the largest investment ever in the history of province in our next generation, in our children, and an investment that all of us in this House and across the province can be so very, very proud of. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, it's an investment in schools in Rosthern and Weyburn that are being built as we speak. Mr. Speaker, it's an investment in schools and planning for schools in the community of Moose Jaw. And I would note that the Empire School in Moose Jaw opened in 1909. It's an old school, Mr. Speaker. We only have one member in this assembly that may have been around at that point in time, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it provides planning dollars, and we will be constructing a new school here in the city of Regina. Mr. Speaker, a joint use facility here, and planning dollars for the St. Francis School in the community of Saskatoon. Most certainly investment that the people of this province expect their provincial government to continue to invest in that next generation. 46 new schools now under planning or being constructed in this province, Mr. Speaker, expanding, as I said, the supports in the classroom, but also expanding the services that are being offered in the way of childcare, the services that are being offered into those facilities by funding our community-based organizations and our early childhood intervention programs, Mr. Speaker. Most certainly services important to our young families that call our communities home. Mr. Speaker, with respect to health care, something near and dear to my heart, again, the largest investment in the history of the province of Saskatchewan, an investment we can be so proud of. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, there's more than $400 million in funding for targeted mental health care and addictions initiatives. Also, Mr. Speaker, the largest mental health care investment in this province, up $30 million from last year, Mr. Speaker. This is an investment that we can be so proud of in our communities, and I hearken back, Mr. Speaker, and I will get here towards the end of the opening of our Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford and the investment that has been made there, Mr. Speaker, and we can talk about the dollars, and I want to talk a little bit about the facility, but at the end, Mr. Speaker, I want to come back to what really matters, and that is the people, Mr. Speaker, that have the opportunity to heal in a facility like that. But as I said, this is the largest single investment in mental health services in the province's history in the community of North Battleford, replacing that over 100-year-old facility. Beautiful facility, expansion of capacity with 284 beds, 3.5 football fields long, Mr. Speaker, if you can imagine that, and it's hard to imagine until you actually drive up to the facility. Natural light, Mr. Speaker, and I would encourage all members to tour this facility because it is beautiful, absolutely a beautiful facility, and I could not believe the natural light, Mr. Speaker, that is coming into virtually each and every room in that facility, and the spectacular view that they have of the river, Mr. Speaker, of the community. Is truly, there is more room for activities in that. I've never seen so many basketball hoops, to be honest with you. And a gym for patients, Mr. Speaker. We toured the woodworking shop, Mr. Speaker. The family visitation rooms as well as the spiritual center. This is an investment that is so much more than the replacement of a facility, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the expansion of capacity, but also the expansion of services that are being offered in that facility. This is most notably, Mr. Speaker, what the people of this province have asked for and can expect. And it's what they're receiving, Mr. Speaker. Also, with respect to health care, and again on our record, Mr. Speaker, over the course of the last decade, this budget strikes the right balance with respect to investment in healthcare professionals. $23 million to hire doctors that will work directly, doctors, nurses, and other staff actually, that will work directly in what we will open later this year, Mr. Speaker, in the Jim Pattison's Children's Hospital in the community of Saskatoon. Again, Mr. Speaker, an expansion of capacity and a great expansion of services that we simply had to leave the province for over the course of our history. Now those will be offered in our largest centre of Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, there's a number of investments as well in this budget that aren't large financial investments, Mr. Speaker, but by listening to people across the province, they're just the right thing to do. They just truly are, and often they take a lot more effort on mapping the path on how you can actually successfully get to these points of success, if you will, and it's a journey, not an event, to quote the Minister of Finance on so many times. But I think of the conversation we had on the morning of the budget, Mr. Speaker, the Ministers of Health, both of them and myself, with Chris and Aaron Willenborg, Mr. Speaker. Quite a story with respect to their story on organ donation, Mr. Speaker, and their story of love, quite frankly, with a proposal, but only a wedding after the husband, the fiance, donated a kidney to his future wife. Mr. Speaker, in Saskatchewan, there's always the 3 degrees of separation, and Aaron's late father, Mr. Speaker, who was also going to be a donor until they had discovered cancer in his kidney, Mr. Speaker, and he succumbed to that disease, was a professor of mine about 1,000 years ago when I attended the University of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Terry Tollefson. And to have a conversation with Chris and Aaron Willenborg that very morning, and to move forward with what is a small amount of funding but a great initiative in the creation of a provincial organ donor registry, Mr. Speaker, is what really matters in what we do in this building, Mr. Speaker. It's not always statistics. It's not always about the money, Mr. Speaker. It's about the effect that investment has, and that is one example of a small investment in this budget that has a very large effect on people's lives and families across the province. I can think of another investment, a relatively small investment, Mr. Speaker, with respect to training physiotherapists across this province, $100,000 investments, but training physiotherapists for complete decongestive therapy for patients who suffer from lymphedema, Mr. Speaker. I have a close friend of mine that has suffered through lymphedema throughout his life. Quite frankly, has been told a few decades ago that he would not be here today, Mr. Speaker, and I know others as well struggling with this disease. Not a high number of people, but most certainly an appreciated investment, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that we are providing the services that our families have asked us to provide across the province, Mr. Speaker. There's the investment in our autism individualized funding benefit. Again, an investment in the services that our families, and in many cases, again, our children, our next generation, really are expecting us to have discussions in this place, Mr. Speaker, have discussions about how we can move forward with those initiatives that are so very, very important. But as I said, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the statistics, in this budget, Mr. Speaker, they are well and good, and they are important. They are so very important, actually, with respect to the hospitals that we are building, opening the Children's Hospital, funding in this budget, Mr. Speaker, to advance the Weyburn Hospital, the Victoria Hospital in Prince Albert, the schools that I had mentioned, Mr. Speaker, that have been built or planning and being built, Mr. Speaker, the investments in our classrooms and the supports, so very important for all of us across the province. But what it really comes down to at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, is the people. People like Cassidy Evans, again, the Minister of Health and myself, and have had the opportunity to converse with Cassidy so very many times. I keep her lemon on my desk, Mr. Speaker. As we all know, she's in the business of selling lemonade, Mr. Speaker, and I'm hoping to see her down here this spring in this session so that I can purchase and encourage everyone in this House and in this city to buy a cup of lemonade from Cassidy Evans, because it's going to such a good cause. Mr. Speaker, it's going to raise money for cystic fibrosis research, Mr. Speaker, to find a cure for another disease that we just need to keep working for, Mr. Speaker, disease that Cassidy is working through, Mr. Speaker. She sent me another letter that I keep on my desk as well. I think of Megan Allard, Mr. Speaker, a constituent of mine in the community of Spiritwood, constituent that is part of the AIMS program, the Ability in Me program, Mr. Speaker. She sent me 4 pair of socks the other day. My wife took a pair, my daughter took a pair, and then they took the other 2 pair and gave them to someone else. I didn't get a pair to wear on the day I was supposed to wear them, and I apologize to Megan for that. So I wore my shark socks, Mr. Speaker, my mismatching shark socks, which frightened me all day long, Mr. Speaker. But Megan continually goes above and beyond what anybody could ever expect of her in her volunteering in her community, and it started years ago in her school, Mr. Speaker, and it has only increased as she's now a full member of the Spiritwood Lions, Mr. Speaker, and working so hard to better her community each and every day, and a true example for all of us to follow. Mr. Speaker, I think of a few weeks ago when we had the opportunity to open the Saskatchewan Hospital, North Battleford, with so many colleagues here. It brings back memories of the announcement years ago where the member from Indian Head Milestone was part of that, the previous leader. So many in this room were part of that announcement, part of that whole process, Mr. Speaker, of building that very large facility, Mr. Speaker. As I said, 3.5 football fields long, and when you drive up to it, it is daunting, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker. And I think of Carrie, who spoke at that opening. Carrie is a resident, a patient at the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford. She presented the government, Mr. Speaker, and I accepted on behalf of the government a key to the Saskatchewan Hospital North Battleford that was built in the workshop, Mr. Speaker, were all the tools were actually donated by an individual, and we thank all of the donors in that facility. But she gave us a key to return at any time for a visit, Mr. Speaker. That key hangs in the Premier's office in this building, Mr. Speaker, as a reminder of that investment, but it's a reminder of why that investment is important. And here's why. I want to quote Carrie, Mr. Speaker. We love having our room for privacy, convenience, and being able to make it our own space. Mr. Speaker, she had talked prior to that comment about not wanting to move into this new, large, very daunting facility until she came in and actually had a look around. Then she had this to say, Mr. Speaker, she said, I quote, "We also love having our own bathroom. I only have to share a bathroom with one other person as opposed to 20. I love having all of the windows and having all of the sunshine to warm our hearts." Mr. Speaker, the Saskatchewan Hospital, North Battleford, is not a daunting place for Carrie. It's her home. And it's a home to so many more there today and will be for so many more into the future, Mr. Speaker. That's why this budget and that investment in striking the right balance is so very, very important. It's because of Cassidy. It's because of Cassidy, it's because of Megan, it's because of Carrie, and it's because of all of the other people across this province that we represent, Mr. Speaker. So we're proud. We're very proud of this budget that was introduced last week by our Minister of Finance, the member for Humboldt. She delivered this budget with the right balance. She delivered it on behalf of the people of the province, and it's a budget that ensures not only our fiscal sustainability of our province while we are able to retain that investment capacity into the future. It's a balanced budget that provides no tax increases, Mr. Speaker, no new taxes. It's a balanced budget with the largest investment in education in the history of the province of Saskatchewan. It's a balanced budget that strikes the right balance with the largest investment in health care in the history of the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and it's a balanced budget that provides more support to those most vulnerable in our communities that need a hand up. Mr. Speaker, this is a balanced budget that continues the investment in crucial infrastructure that we spoke to that will ensure that our Saskatchewan economy remains competitive, again, not just today, but years into the future. And it's a balanced budget that will support the growth and progress of our communities across Saskatchewan. And it's a balanced budget that keeps the faith with the families that we serve in this Assembly across our province. Mr. Speaker, it's for these reasons and so many more that I will not be supporting the amendment that was put forward by the member from Regina Rosemont, and I will be supporting the budget that was introduced last week by the member from Humboldt, our Finance Minister, and seconded by the member from Indian Head, Milestone. Here, here.